By the time you're hearing this, the official death toll has climbed past 900, with thousands injured, and more than 50,000 names on a missing persons list. And here's the part almost no one is telling you. The danger didn't stay in Venezuela. Hundreds of miles to the north, a warning went out to two American territories, Puerto Rico, the United States Virgin Islands, a tsunami advisory for a strike-slip earthquake. And if you know how earthquakes actually make waves, that combination should stop you cold, because a sideways grinding fault like this one is not supposed to be able to do that. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what happened in those 39 seconds, why a fault that slides sideways triggered a tsunami alert on American soil, what really drowned 40 people in Puerto Rico a century ago, and why the truth about that night is far more unsettling than any conspiracy you've seen online. I'm going to show you the data, the real agencies, the real numbers, no fear-mongering, no invented experts, just what the seafloor actually did and what it could do next. This is the Horizon Lab. If you want the version of these events that's built on evidence instead of panic, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Start with what we know for certain, because the certainty is bad enough. The United States Geological Survey logged two events near the town of San Felipe in north-central Venezuela, roughly 280 miles west of the capital. First the 7.2, then the 7.5. The agency's automated impact system, called Pager, did something it rarely does. It issued a red alert. Red is the top of the scale. Red means high casualties and widespread damage are not a risk, they're an expectation. The same model estimated the eventual toll could run into the thousands, possibly far higher. That's not a tabloid guess. That's the USGS, reading the magnitude, the depth, the population, and the building stock, and telling emergency planners to brace. And the geography made it worse in a way you can't see from a map. Caracas sits in a long, narrow valley packed with soft sediment. When seismic waves hit soft ground, they don't just pass through, they slow down, they pile up, and they amplify. The same shaking that might rattle a city built on bedrock can flatten one built on a sediment basin. That Caracas learned that lesson before. It was about to relearn it. Buildings came down in the capital and along the coast, in the port state of La Guaira, where whole apartment blocks folded into the street. But the story that pulls all of this together, the thread that reaches from a Venezuelan fault line all the way to a beach in Puerto Rico, isn't the shaking at all. It's the water. It's the advisory that went out and then got cancelled, and the reason it was ever issued in the first place. Because the people who watch these faults for a living didn't relax when the shaking stopped. They watched the sea. And to understand why, we have to go back to the 39 seconds and look at what those two quakes really were. Here's something strange about that night. The first earthquake, the 7.2, wasn't the main event. Seismologists now classify it as a foreshock. The 7.5 that followed 39 seconds later was the mainshock. And that ordering, foreshock first, mainshock second, may have saved more lives than any rescue team. Think about what 39 seconds actually buys you. It's not enough time to drive anywhere. It's not enough time to think. But it is enough time to feel a violent jolt, to register fear in your body before your brain catches up, and to get out of a building. James Jackson, who heads Earth Sciences at the University of Cambridge, said exactly that. The smaller shock got people out of buildings before the bigger one hit, and the bigger one is what brought the weakened structures down. That's a brutal kind of luck, because the alternative, a single 7.5 with no warning, would have caught people asleep, or sitting at a table, or in a stairwell. Instead, across Caracas and the coast, people were already moving, already in the street, already looking up. Now, why two large quakes so close together? This is what's called an earthquake doublet. Two ruptures of comparable size near the same place, separated by seconds to days. They're uncommon, but they're real and they're documented. The reason they matter here is mechanical. The first rupture changes the stress on the rock around it. Sometimes it relieves pressure, sometimes it loads the neighboring fault segment past its breaking point, almost instantly. When that happens, the second fault lets go. 39 seconds is extreme, but it's not impossible, and it's not supernatural. It's stress transfer, happening at the speed of rock failing under strain. The epicenters clustered near San Felipe and the area around Umare and Moron, on the northern side of the country, close to the coast. That location matters for a reason we'll come back to, because a fault that runs along a coastline has options that an inland fault does not. It can shake a city, and it can disturb the sea floor. The human numbers from those first hours tell you how fast a disaster like this outruns the people trying to measure it. In the first 6 hours, the official count was 32 dead and around 700 injured. By the next day, it was at least 188, then 235. Then, as the National Assembly reported from Caracas, it passed 900, with more than 3,000 injured and over 170 people still trapped under rubble. More than 50,000 names went onto a website set up to track the missing. Now, missing is not the same as dead. In the chaos after a quake, with communications down, families register anyone they can't reach. Many of those people are alive, just unreachable. But the gap between confirmed dead and reported missing is the gap rescuers were racing to close, by hand, in many places, because the heavy machinery simply wasn't there. And there was one more factor working in the background that day, quiet and almost invisible in the data. June 24th is a national holiday in Venezuela. It marks the Battle of Carabobo from 1821, which means that when the ground moved at around 6 in the evening, a lot of people weren't in office towers or factories. They were home. Whether that lowered the toll or simply changed where the deaths happened is something investigators will study for years. But it's a reminder that the size of a disaster isn't set by the magnitude alone. It's set by where people are, what they're standing inside of, and the ground beneath the foundation. Which brings us to the fault itself, the one that almost nobody outside of seismology was watching. Everyone knows the San Andreas. Almost no one outside the region knows the San Sebastián, and yet the San Sebastián Fault system, running along the north of Venezuela, is the same kind of beast. It's the boundary between two of the planet's great tectonic plates. To the south, the South American plate. To the north, the Caribbean plate. And they are not colliding head-on. They're grinding past each other, sideways, in what geologists call a right-lateral strike-slip motion. Stand on one side, watch the other, and over geologic time the far side slides to your right. This is the same family of motion as the San Andreas in California, sideways, not up and down. And that single fact, sideways, not up and down, is the key to the entire mystery of this video. Hold on to it. The boundary here isn't one clean crack. It's a broad, messy zone that scientists describe as transpressional, a word that just means the plates are both sliding past each other and squeezing at the same time. Within that zone, the San Sebastián Fault runs mostly offshore, just north of Venezuela's coastal mountains. Farther east, it hands off to another fault, the El Pilar, with a stretched open basin called the Cariaco Pull-Apart sitting between them. Together, the offshore San Sebastián and El Pilar faults make up around 250 miles of this plate boundary. That's a lot of loaded rock, sitting right next to where people live. And it has a history. This same system produced large, destructive earthquakes long before anyone had a seismograph to record them. The June 2026 mainshock became the strongest in Venezuela since the year 1900, when the San Narciso earthquake struck the same general boundary. More than a century of relative quiet on a fault doesn't mean the fault is safe. It often means the opposite. Strain has been accumulating the entire time, locked rock, bending under pressure like a stick you keep bending without letting it snap. When it finally goes, it releases everything it's been storing. Now here's where the location turns dangerous in a second, hidden way. Because this fault runs offshore, along the coast, the rupture didn't just shake the land, it moved the sea floor. And when you move the sea floor, you have to ask a question that has nothing to do with how hard the ground shook in Caracas. You have to ask what the ocean did. A purely sideways, strike-slip rupture is famously bad at making tsunamis. It moves rock horizontally, and a tsunami needs the seafloor to move vertically, to lift or drop the entire column of water above it. So on paper, a strike-slip quake should be a poor tsunami maker. That's the textbook answer. That's what most coverage will tell you. if they mention it at all. So why, within minutes of the main shock, did a tsunami advisory go out for Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, hundreds of miles away? Why did the people who monitor Caribbean tsunamis treat a sideways fault as a water threat? The textbook says it shouldn't matter. The warning centers acted like it might. One of them was wrong, and the reason they issued that advisory anyway is the most important piece of science in this entire story. Let's be precise about what happened, because this is where rumor takes over if you let it. After the main shock, a tsunami advisory was issued for Puerto Rico and the United States Virgin Islands. Not a warning, an advisory, which is a specific, lower tier that means stay out of the water and off the beach. Strong currents and localized waves are possible, but widespread coastal flooding is not expected. It was issued, and then, within hours, it was cancelled. No destructive tsunami crossed the Caribbean that night. Let me say that clearly, because somewhere online, someone is editing a video to imply otherwise. There was no wall of water. The advisory was a precaution, and the precaution was lifted. But the precaution itself is the interesting part. Why issue it at all for a strike-slip earthquake that, by the textbook, shouldn't move enough water vertically to matter? Because the people running the tsunami warning centers don't trust the textbook alone. They know something about this kind of earthquake that doesn't fit on a single line of a diagram. They know that the shaking itself, regardless of the fault's direction, is a trigger, and what it can trigger, on the steep, sediment-loaded slopes of an undersea continental margin, is a landslide, an underwater avalanche, and an underwater landslide can make a tsunami even when the fault that caused it cannot. Think about it physically. The fault moves sideways. Fine. That alone barely budges the water. But the energy from that rupture radiates out as violent shaking, and that shaking hits the edge of the continental shelf, where enormous volumes of loose sediment sit perched on slopes at the angle of repose, just barely stable. Shake them hard enough, and they let go. Millions of tons of mud and rock slump downhill in seconds, displacing the water above them. That displacement is vertical. That is how you get a wave. So when the warning centers saw a magnitude 7.5 rupture on a coastal fault with the seafloor close by, they didn't ask only how the fault moved. They asked whether the shaking could have shaken something loose. They couldn't rule it out in real time. So they did the responsible thing. They told 2 American territories to step back from the water until they could confirm the sea was safe. And then, when the buoys and the tide gauges showed nothing dangerous developing, they cancelled it. That is exactly how the system is supposed to work. A precaution, issued fast, lifted fast, based on data. Now, here's why this isn't just bureaucratic caution. The Caribbean has done this before. It has killed people this way before. A sideways or near-sideways earthquake, a triggered submarine landslide, and a local tsunami that arrives not in hours, but in minutes, on a coastline full of people who never felt the need to run. The warning centers were not being paranoid. They were remembering. They were remembering a morning in 1918 off the coast of Puerto Rico when the ocean did exactly this, and 40 people drowned because of a wave that, by the textbook, the earthquake should never have been able to produce. And that is the heart of this story. Not the shaking, the water that a sideways fault is not supposed to move. We're going to take that mechanism apart next, piece by piece, and then walk straight into what happened in 1918. Because once you understand it, you'll never look at a coastal earthquake the same way again. Let's slow down and build the mechanism from the ground up, because this is the single idea that separates the truth from the panic. A tsunami is not a wind wave. A wind wave is the ocean's surface getting pushed around by a storm. A tsunami is the entire column of water, top to bottom, getting lifted or dropped all at once, and then trying to find its level again. To move that much water, you need to move the seafloor itself, vertically, up or down. That's the rule. Now picture our 2 kinds of earthquake. A megathrust quake, the kind that happens where one plate dives under another, thrusts the seafloor upward by feet, sometimes by tens of feet, across hundreds of miles. That is a tsunami machine. That's what produced the waves in the Indian Ocean in 2004 and off Japan in 2011. But a strike-slip quake, like the one in Venezuela, moves the rock sideways. It slides one block past another, The vertical motion is tiny by comparison, so the water above it barely notices. By that logic, a strike-slip fault should be nearly silent at sea. So how does a sideways fault kill people with water? It doesn't, not directly. It cheats. Here's the everyday version. Imagine a steep hillside covered in loose gravel, sitting right at the edge of stability, the angle where one more pebble would start a slide. Now imagine standing next to it and slamming the ground with a sledgehammer. You didn't push the gravel, you shook it, and the shaking was enough to break the fragile grip holding it in place. The whole slope lets go. Now move that hillside underwater, to the edge of a continental shelf, where millions of years of sediment have piled up on slopes far steeper and far more loaded than people imagine. The earthquake doesn't have to lift that material, it just has to shake it loose. And when a submarine slope fails, millions of tons of mud and rock avalanche downhill into deep water, and they shove the ocean vertically out of the way as they go. That vertical shove is your tsunami. This is not a fringe theory. It's one of the most active areas of tsunami science, and it explains a whole class of waves that used to baffle researchers, waves that were far too big for the earthquake that supposedly caused them. The answer, again and again, turned out to be a hidden landslide. The fault was just the trigger, the slope was the gun. And it gets more unsettling, not less, when you look at timing. A tsunami from a distant megathrust gives you hours of warning. It has to cross an ocean. But a landslide tsunami is born right at the coast, on the local shelf, a few miles offshore. It doesn't travel far. It arrives in minutes, 4 minutes, 7 minutes, less time than it takes to read the alert on your phone. There is no warning center on Earth fast enough to save you from a local landslide tsunami if you wait for an official message. The only warning is the earthquake itself. That's why the people watching the Caribbean that night didn't shrug at a strike-slip quake. They know the seafloor north of South America and around the islands is steep, sediment-heavy, and capable of failing. They couldn't see, in real time, whether the Venezuela mainshock had shaken a slope loose somewhere. So they assumed it might have, warned the American territories nearest the threat, watched the tide gauges and the deep ocean buoys, and stood down only when the data came back clean. It came back clean this time. The slope held, the ocean stayed where it belonged. But the reason that outcome felt like relief, instead of routine, is that everyone in that room knew the version of this story where the slope does not hold. They'd read it. It happened to American citizens. And we're about to. It's easy, from inside the United States, to file this away as something that happened somewhere else. A foreign country, a foreign fault, a tragedy on the news. But the tsunami advisory tells you the truth. This reached American soil. Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands are not bystanders to Caribbean tectonics. They sit directly on the same restless boundary between the Caribbean plate and the plates around it. The very same kind of grinding, locking, sediment-loaded margin that just failed in Venezuela runs right past San Juan, right past Charlotte Amalie. When a tsunami advisory goes out for those islands, it is not a courtesy. It is a recognition that the people there live on the front line of this exact hazard. And the American response made the connection physical. Within days, the United States did something the State Department rarely does. It activated not 1, not 2, but 3 of its elite urban search and rescue task forces and sent them south. Virginia Task Force 1, out of Fairfax County, flew in with around 79 personnel, 6 canine teams, structural engineers and doctors. A task force from California, drawn from the Los Angeles County system, joined the effort. And then, in what officials called a rare third activation, a team from Miami-Dade County, Florida, 80 more personnel and 6 more search dogs deployed as well. These are the same teams the US sends to its own collapsed buildings, its own hurricanes, its own disasters. They went to Venezuela. That happened, and this is worth saying plainly and without spin, against a tense diplomatic backdrop between Washington and Caracas. The two governments have been at odds, and yet the rescue teams flew, the aid was pledged, and the Secretary of State said the priority was search and rescue. I'm not here to litigate the politics. I'm here to point out the geology doesn't care about any of it. A fault does not check passports. The same plate boundary that buckled buildings in La Guaira reaches its fingers all the way to American beaches, and the people who plan for disasters know it, which is why they treat a Venezuelan earthquake as a regional event, not a foreign one. Here's the part that should sit with you. Puerto Rico has been part of the United States since 1898. For well over a century, American citizens have lived on a coastline that faces one of the most tsunami-capable stretches of seafloor in the Atlantic world. Most of them have never been told that. There are no tsunami sirens humming in the background of daily life there, the way there are along parts of the Pacific Northwest. The hazard is real, it's documented, and it's underwarned. And the reason we can say that with confidence isn't a model or a guess, it's a body count. Because the seafloor near Puerto Rico has already done this. It did it on a Friday morning, more than 100 years ago, and the people who died had even less warning than you'd have today. October 11th, 1918, 10:14 in the morning. Puerto Rico had been an American territory for 20 years. The western towns, Aguadilla, Anasco, Rincon, Mayagüez, lived with their backs to the mountains and their faces to the sea. Fishing boats, sugar wharves, warehouses crowded right up to the waterline, built of masonry and timber, most of it never designed to survive hard shaking. There were no tsunami sirens, no island-wide seismic network, no early warning system of any kind. What stood between those towns and the ocean was human memory and luck. At 10:14, an earthquake estimated today at around magnitude 7.3 ruptured in the Mona Passage, the deep channel between Puerto Rico and the island of Hispaniola, roughly 30 miles northwest of Aguadilla. The shaking alone was violent, rated at the high end of the intensity scale. In Mayagüez, the largest city in the path, around 700 masonry buildings were damaged and 1,000 wooden houses battered. The church, the post office, the theatre, the city hall, all severely hit. The science building of the agricultural college caught fire. The Punta Borinquen lighthouse, a Spanish-built sentinel on the coast, was destroyed. But the shaking wasn't what made this disaster infamous. Within 4 to 7 minutes of the quake, the sea did something the survivors would never forget. It pulled back. The ocean withdrew from the shore, exposing reefs and stretches of seafloor that no one had ever seen at low tide. To a fishing town, that retreat is the oldest warning in the world, and the cruelest, because it means the water is gathering itself to return. And it returned. A tsunami swept the western and northern coasts with run-up heights reaching close to 20 feet in places. Whole coastal villages were destroyed. When the count was finally made, somewhere between 76 and 116 people had died from the disaster, and of those, around 40 drowned in the wave itself, 32 of them in Aguadilla alone. Now here is the detail that makes 1918 the ancestor of June 2026. For decades, scientists assumed a fault rupture had lifted the seafloor and made the wave. But newer surveys, using high-resolution sonar, found something else down there. A fresh submarine landslide, about 30 square miles of failed seafloor, an estimated 10 cubic kilometers of material. Its scar starting nearly 4,000 feet down and sliding into water more than 13,000 feet deep. Submarine telegraph cables in that exact area were snapped at the time of the quake. The researchers' conclusion was direct. The landslide, triggered by the earthquake, was the primary cause of the tsunami, not the fault, the slope. Do you hear the echo? A coastal earthquake, shaking that loosened a submarine slope, a wave that arrived in minutes, from a fault that, by itself, had no business making one. That is the precise scenario the warning centers were afraid of when they looked at Venezuela and reached for the alert on Puerto Rico. They weren't guessing. They were refusing to be surprised the same way twice. Faults keep a kind of memory, written in rock and in ruins, and the boundary that just ruptured under Venezuela has one of the longest and bloodiest records in the hemisphere. The June 2026 mainshock was the strongest in the country since the year 1900, when the San Narciso earthquake tore along this same Caribbean-South American boundary and rang across the region. 125 years of comparative quiet on the deadliest stretch of that fault, and then, in 39 seconds, the silence ended. But to feel the real weight of this boundary, you have to go back further, to a date burned into Venezuelan history, March 26, 1812. It was a religious holiday, and churches across the region were full when a massive earthquake struck. Caracas and several other cities were devastated. The death toll has never been pinned to a single number, and honest sources give a wide range, anywhere from around 15,000 to as many as 26,000 people. Whatever the true figure, it was a catastrophe that reshaped the country, striking, by terrible coincidence, in the middle of Venezuela's war of independence. The same plate boundary, the same sideways grind, a different century, and a wound the nation never fully forgot. Then come closer in time to 1967, the Caracas earthquake of that year, a magnitude in the mid-sixes, was far smaller than the 1812 disaster, but it struck a modern city full of modern buildings, and it exposed exactly the vulnerability we talked about earlier. Caracas sits in a basin of soft sediment, and the shaking pooled and amplified in that basin. More than 200 people were killed, many of them in tall buildings that resonated with the seismic waves and failed. It was, until this June, the last earthquake of real consequence to strike the capital. An entire generation grew up with 1967 as the worst thing the ground had done in living memory. That generation just had its benchmark broken. String these together, and a pattern emerges that no honest scientist would call random. 1812, 1900, 1967, 2026. This is not a fault that fires once and goes to sleep forever. It's a plate boundary, a place where the Earth's outer shell is permanently in motion, storing strain decade after decade, and releasing it in violent, irregular bursts. The quiet years are not safety, they're the loading phase, and the offshore segments of this system, the San Sebastián and the El Pilar running for 250 miles along the coast, are precisely the segments that combine two threats in one. They can level a coastal city with shaking, and because they sit at the edge of the sea, over those steep, sediment-laden slopes, they hold the power to shake a submarine landslide loose and send a wave at the shore. So when you hear that the June quake was the strongest in 125 years, don't hear reassurance, as if the big one is now spent and decades away. That's not how plate boundaries work. A great earthquake can transfer stress to neighboring segments and bring them closer to failure, not further from it. The fault's memory is long, and right now it is wide awake. Numbers can go numb on you. 900 dead, 3,000 injured, 50,000 names on a list. Say them enough times and they stop landing. So let me ground them in what the hours after the quake actually looked like, using only what's been reported on the record, because this is a channel that doesn't invent people to make you feel something. Start with the timing, because it's almost unbearable. June 24th is a national holiday in Venezuela, marking the Battle of Carabobo from 1821. Schools closed, many offices closed, so when the ground let go at around 6 in the evening, a great many people were exactly where the buildings were weakest and most crowded, at home, in the apartment blocks of Caracas and the coastal towns of La Guaira. A holiday meant to celebrate a nation's birth became the reason so many of its people were indoors when the walls came down. Then came the response, and the response is its own kind of heartbreak. In the hardest-hit coastal city of La Guaira, the official rescue presence was thin in the critical first day. Heavy machinery, cranes, lifting equipment, the gear you need to move a collapsed concrete slab, was in desperately short supply in many places. So the people did it themselves. Neighbors dug through the wreckage of their own buildings with their hands. Residents from the nearby city of Valencia loaded supplies and drove through the night toward the coast. People in Caracas carried their own food and water down the highway to help. One volunteer, Sebastián Arias, described the scene as moving between neighborhoods where building after building had collapsed. Some sites swarmed with helpers, others with no one, and nothing. He said he didn't even feel like taking photos. He just felt shocked. The hospitals tell the same story. The José María Vargas Hospital was overwhelmed so fast that some of the injured had to be treated outdoors. A health system already strained by years of national crisis was asked, in a single evening, to absorb thousands of wounded people. The government declared a state of emergency, shut the damaged international airport after cracks appeared in the terminal roof, cut the gas supply to prevent explosions in collapsed buildings, and stood up field hospitals and military supply lines. Aid teams converged from Mexico, Spain, Chile, El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Qatar, the United Nations, and, as we said, the United States. And then there's that missing persons list, more than 50,000 names. I want to be careful and honest here, the way the reporting is. 50,000 reported missing does not mean 50,000 dead. In a disaster with downed communications, families register everyone they can't reach. Most of those people are alive, cut off, unreachable, not gone. But that enormous number is a measure of something real, the sheer reach of the fear. The number of households in the country who spent that night not knowing. That's the human shape of a magnitude 7.5 on a coastal fault near a capital city. Not an abstraction. A city full of people digging with their hands, by the light of their phones, hoping the next slab they lift has someone breathing underneath it. Hold that picture, because we're about to go back to cold mechanism, to why the ground was so lethal in this particular place. But the mechanism only matters because of the people in that picture. The science is in service of them, never the other way around. Why was this earthquake so deadly? A magnitude 7.5 is enormous, no question. But magnitude alone doesn't decide a death toll. Earthquakes of similar size strike sparsely populated or well-built regions and kill almost no one. To understand why this one was a catastrophe, you have to stack up 3 separate factors and watch them multiply. The first is depth. This was a shallow earthquake. When a rupture happens close to the surface, the energy doesn't have far to travel before it reaches the cities above. It arrives with brutal intensity. A deep quake of the same magnitude spreads its energy out over a longer path and softens by the time it reaches people. Shallow means sharp. Shallow means violent. This one was shallow. The second factor we've already touched, but it deserves its full weight now, because it's the silent killer in city after city around the world. It's the ground itself. Caracas is built in a long valley filled with soft sediment, and soft sediment does something vicious to seismic waves. When a wave traveling through hard bedrock hits a basin of loose sediment, it slows down and its energy concentrates, and the soft material can shake several times harder and several times longer than the bedrock right next to it. Engineers call it site amplification. It's why 2 buildings the same distance from the same earthquake can have completely different fates. One cracked, one collapsed, depending only on the dirt under the foundation. Caracas learned this in 1967, when tall buildings on the soft basin resonated with the shaking and failed. The lesson was written in 200 lives. The basin didn't move, the buildings on it just changed. The third factor is the building stock, and this is the most human and the most fixable of the 3. Where construction is reinforced, ductile, designed to flex and ride out shaking, people live. Where it's brittle, unreinforced or poorly maintained, people die. A British seismologist, James Jackson of Cambridge, noted after the quake that some buildings actually held up better than experts had feared, suggesting construction quality in places was higher than expected. That's a glimmer of good news inside the grief. But across Caracas and La Guaira, too much of the building stock could not take a shallow 7.5 on amplified ground, and it came down. Now layer in the USCA's pager system, the tool that issued that red alert in the first hour. Pager doesn't wait for body counts. It takes the magnitude, the depth, the location, the population exposed, and a global database of how buildings in that region tend to perform, and it estimates the human toll before rescuers have reached a single street. For this event, it estimated a substantial probability of deaths in the tens of thousands. That estimate may turn out to be too high, and several scientists now hope it will, partly because of the holiday timing, partly because of the foreshock that emptied buildings, partly because of that better-than-feared construction. But the red alert did its job. It told the world, in the first hour, that this was a major humanitarian disaster, and to move. Depth, soil, and structures. That's the trinity that turns shaking into death, and not one of them is visible in the single number everyone quotes. Zoom out from Venezuela now, and look at the whole Caribbean, because this region carries a hazard that is genuinely underappreciated, and the June quake is a reminder, written in capital letters. The Caribbean is ringed and threaded by plate boundaries, subduction zones, where one plate dives beneath another, capable of the largest tsunami-making megathrust quakes, strike slip systems like the San Sebastián and El Pilar, and everywhere, Steep undersea slopes piled with sediment, the exact conditions for the landslide tsunamis we've been describing. It is, in tsunami terms, a loaded and crowded room. North of Puerto Rico lies the Puerto Rico Trench, one of the deepest places in the Atlantic Ocean and the site of a subduction boundary. Scientists studying coastal sediments have found evidence of a major tsunami striking northwest Puerto Rico sometime between roughly 1470 and 1530, likely from a great earthquake on that trench, centuries before any written record on the island. The deep history of this sea is full of waves. We've simply forgotten most of them, because they happened before anyone was keeping score. And here's the problem that makes the Caribbean uniquely dangerous: the 4-minute problem. The threats here are close. A megathrust tsunami crossing the Pacific can give Hawaii or California many hours of warning. But a Caribbean tsunami, whether from a nearby fault or a triggered submarine landslide, is generated right at the doorstep, minutes offshore. In 1918, the wave reached the coast of Puerto Rico in 4 to 7 minutes. No alert system in existence can detect a wave, confirm it, issue a message, and have people read it and run to high ground in 4 minutes. The technology is not the bottleneck. The speed of the ocean is. Which means the only warning system that actually works against a local tsunami is the one built into your own body. If you are on a Caribbean coast, or any coast near an offshore fault, and the ground shakes so hard you can't stand, or it shakes for a long rolling minute, that is the warning. Not your phone, not a siren, the shaking itself. The official guidance from the tsunami warning centers and from geologists who study this is simple, and it is old. If the shaking is strong, do not wait for confirmation. Move inland or to high ground immediately and stay there. In 1918, the people who survived the wave were the ones who understood, instinctively, that the sea pulling back was not a curiosity to photograph, but a command to run. That's the real lesson the Venezuela advisory was trying to teach, quietly, before it got cancelled. It said to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, in effect, "We can't promise you'll get more notice than this next time." The system worked this week. The slope held, the buoys stayed flat, the advisory lifted. But the warning centers know, and now you know, that the margin between a cancelled advisory and a catastrophe is sometimes nothing more than whether one underwater hillside decided to hold or let go. That uncertainty is uncomfortable, and it is exactly the discomfort that the conspiracy version of this story tries to replace with something false, and strangely, more comforting. Now we have to deal with the other story. Because every time the Earth does something violent and frightening, a second narrative grows up beside the real one, and it spreads faster, because it offers something the truth can't. It offers a villain. So let's name the claims, and take each one apart with physics, not insults. Claim 1. The earthquake was engineered. A weapon. You'll see the acronyms, and you'll see them tied to the very real tensions between the United States and Venezuela, the argument being that a quake at this political moment is too convenient to be natural. Here is the problem, and it's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of energy. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake releases energy on the order of the largest nuclear weapons ever built, and it releases it deep inside solid rock, along a fault that geologists have mapped for decades and that has produced great earthquakes since long before any modern technology existed. 1812, 1900, 1967, there is no device, classified or otherwise, that puts that much energy precisely into a specific fault plane miles underground. The atmospheric heater that the conspiracy points to works on the ionosphere, the thin electrified layer at the edge of space, and it operates at power levels trillions of times too small to influence a tectonic fault. The fault did this. It has always done this. The politics are real. The engineered earthquake is not. Claim 2. A wall of water is coming for Florida, or for the Gulf, or for California this weekend. This one preys on people who half heard the word tsunami. So let me be precise. The only tsunami threat from this event was the brief localized advisory for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and it was cancelled when the data showed no dangerous wave developing. A strike-slip earthquake in Venezuela cannot send a transoceanic wave sweeping across the Gulf of Mexico to Florida. The physics we spent this whole video building tells you why. Sideways faults barely move water vertically, and even the landslide threat is local, measured in miles of coastline, not thousands. There was no wall of water. There is no wall of water coming. Anyone telling you otherwise is harvesting your fear. Claim 3, the one this channel sees constantly. Solar flares or planetary alignments caused the quake. There's a whole online ecosystem that ties earthquakes to the sun, and I want to handle this one honestly, because honesty is the whole point of this channel. For more than a century, scientists have looked for a link between solar activity and earthquakes, and the US Geological Survey is blunt about where that search has landed. No causal relationship has ever been demonstrated. A handful of disputed studies have reported statistical correlations, and a few researchers are still testing possible mechanisms, and that's fair. That's science doing its job. But here's the part that settles it for now. Solar flares rise and fall on the sun's 11-year cycle. Earthquakes don't. Big quakes happen just as readily at solar minimum as at solar maximum, and not one of those studies can predict a quake. The energy a fault releases comes from strain stored in the rock over decades of plate motion. If the sun went quiet tomorrow, the faults would keep moving, because the trigger is inside the earth, not in the sky. So here is where I'll land it, the way we always do. The conspiracy says someone did this. A weapon, a cabal, a hidden hand. And I understand why that's tempting, because a villain you can name is less frightening than a truth you can't control. But look at what the conspiracy is actually offering you. It's offering you the comfort of a world where this only happens when someone chooses it. The real world is worse than that. The real world is a planet whose outer shell is in constant, indifferent motion, storing strain under cities that have stood for centuries, with no schedule, no warning beyond the shaking itself, and no one at the controls. No one engineered this. No one is in control. The truth is more unsettling than the conspiracy, because the truth is that the ground beneath 100 coastal cities is loaded right now, and the only thing we actually get to choose is whether we're ready when it moves. So strip away the panic and the conspiracy, and ask the only question that matters for you personally. What actually keeps people alive when a coastal fault does what the San Sebastián just did? The answer is older and simpler than any app, and it comes in 2 parts, one for the shaking, one for the sea. For the shaking, the lesson of Caracas is the lesson of 1967 and 2026 both, and it's about the ground and the building, not the magnitude. If you live in earthquake country, the single most important fact about your home is not how strong the next quake will be, it's whether your building can ride it out. Reinforced, ductile construction flexes and survives. Brittle, unreinforced construction fails. That's the difference between a cracked wall and a collapsed one, and it's the one factor humans actually control. The earthquake is not negotiable. The building is. And in those first seconds, the guidance that saved the most lives is unglamorous and proven. Drop, cover, hold on. Get under something solid, protect your head, and do not run outside through a curtain of falling debris, which is where many earthquake injuries actually happen. But the second part, the sea, is the one this whole video has been driving toward, and it's the part most coastal residents have never been taught. If you are near the coast, and the shaking is violent, or it goes on for a long, rolling minute, you treat that earthquake as your tsunami warning, full stop. You do not wait for a phone alert, you do not wait for a siren, you do not walk down to the water to see what it's doing, because we now know that a local tsunami, whether from the fault or from a landslide the fault shook loose, can arrive in 4 to 7 minutes, and no warning system on Earth is faster than that. The shaking is the message. The message is, move to high ground, or move inland, now, and stay there until officials say it's over. And there is one more sign, the oldest one, the one the people of Aguadilla saw in 1918. If the ocean suddenly withdraws, draining away from the beach and exposing seafloor that's never normally visible, that is not a marvel to film. That is the trough of a tsunami arriving, the water pulling back before it surges forward. If you ever see the sea retreat like that, you are already in the warning, and you run. The people who understood that sign survived. The people who walked out onto the exposed reef to look did not. That's the whole of it. Know your building. Treat strong coastal shaking as a tsunami warning in itself. And if the sea pulls back, run. None of it requires technology. All of it requires knowing, in advance, what the Earth is telling you, so that when the moment comes, you don't spend your 4 minutes being confused. The warning centers do extraordinary work, and they issued and lifted that Puerto Rico advisory exactly as they should have. But they would be the first to tell you that against a local wave, the most important responder is an informed person who doesn't wait. Let's go back to where we started. 39 seconds, 2 earthquakes near the coast of Venezuela, a 7.2 and then a 7.5, the strongest in 125 years, more than 900 lives lost, and a country digging through the rubble of a holiday evening, and hundreds of miles north, on American soil, a tsunami advisory that flickered on and then off, for 2 islands that live on the same dangerous edge of the same restless plate. That advisory is the thread I want to leave you holding, because it almost passed without notice, a precaution issued and cancelled in the span of an evening, a footnote under the headlines about the dead. But that advisory was the system remembering 1918. It was the quiet acknowledgement that a sideways fault, the kind that supposedly can't make a wave, has killed Americans with water before, by shaking loose a hillside no one could see, on a seafloor no one was watching. This time the slope held, the buoys stayed flat, the ocean stayed where it belonged. We got the version of the story where the precaution turned out to be unnecessary. We don't always get that version. So here's the open question I'll leave you with, the one the geology refuses to answer. We know the offshore segments of this boundary are loaded. We know a great earthquake transfers stress to its neighbors, sometimes pulling them closer to failure. We know the Caribbean seafloor is steep and heavy and capable. What we don't know, what no one knows, is which slope, on which coast, decides to let go next, and whether the people standing on the shore above it will understand what the shaking means before the sea pulls back. That's not a cliffhanger I wrote for drama. It's the honest edge of the science. The fault keeps its own schedule, and it does not tell us in advance. The sea remembers what we forget. It remembered in 1918. It stirred again this week. And the most useful thing any of us can do with that knowledge is refuse to be surprised by it. If this is the kind of breakdown you want, the real data, the real history, the honest debunk, with no one trying to sell you a panic, then subscribe, because this fault is not finished, and neither are we. And if you want to understand the other side of this same danger, the giant that sits off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, the Cascadia subduction zone, the one fault that could send a wall of water at the American mainland with the same few minutes of warning, then that's the question waiting in the next video. Because the Caribbean's 4-minute problem is not the only place in America where the ground is loaded and the clock is short. I'll see you there.